Something is seriously wrong with life in America right now. And I'm not saying that for clicks the data says it for me. Over 60% of Americans are now living paycheck to paycheck, even as the economy is labeled strong. Since 2020, prices for essentials have jumped 25 to 40%, but real wages have barely moved. The average rent is up over 30%, groceries up more than 35%, and yet nearly 1 in 3 Americans has less than $1,000 in savings. People are working more hours, holding more degrees, and carrying more debt than any generation before them, and still falling behind. Life expectancy is declining. Birth rates are collapsing. Medical debt is the leading cause of bankruptcy. Home ownership is slipping out of reach. And the most alarming part? This isn't happening during a depression or a war. This is happening during what we're told is normal. If you feel exhausted, anxious, or quietly asking yourself, "What am I doing all this for?" You're not broken. The system is. And once you see the full picture, it becomes impossible to unsee. Work no longer feels like a path to a life. Something feels deeply off when you wake up every morning, go to work, do everything you were told was right, and yet somehow feel poorer, more exhausted, and less secure every single year. And this isn't just a feeling anymore, it's measurable. If you look at U.S. productivity versus wages, the gap has exploded. Since the late 1970s, worker productivity is up over 60%, while real wages have risen barely 15% after inflation. That means the value you create has been climbing, but your share of it has quietly evaporated. And you feel this when promotions stall, when raises don't keep up with rent, and when loyalty is rewarded with layoffs instead of stability. In 2025 alone, over 300,000 white-collar jobs were cut across tech, finance, media, consulting, and healthcare administration, not because companies were failing, but because they were optimizing. And optimization, in this era, often means squeezing more output from fewer people while telling everyone else to feel grateful they still have a badge. What's worse is that work no longer provides identity or dignity the way it once did. Gallup data shows over 70% of American workers are disengaged, with nearly 1 in 5 actively miserable at work. That's not laziness, that's burnout as a structural feature of the system. You're asked to answer emails at night, stay reachable on weekends, smile through performance reviews that feel arbitrary, and compete against coworkers instead of building with them. And when people say, "Just find a better job," they ignore that the entire labor market has shifted toward insecurity, short contracts, constant restructuring, AI displacement, and benefits quietly disappearing. Even high earners aren't immune. 6-figure salaries used to mean comfort. Now they often mean survival in expensive cities with nothing left after housing, taxes, healthcare, and debt. Work has stopped being a ladder and started feeling like a treadmill, endless motion, no progress, and if you stumble, you're gone. That's not a cultural problem. That's a system problem. The cost of living has quietly broken the social contract. At some point, you start doing the math in your head and realize it doesn't work anymore, not because you're bad with money, but because the numbers themselves are broken. Since 2020, cumulative inflation in the U.S. has exceeded 25%. But essential categories like food, rent, insurance, and utilities have risen far more. Average rents are up 30 to 40% nationally, groceries up over 30%, auto insurance up 20 to 25%, and property taxes and homeowners insurance are exploding in entire regions. And wages, they didn't follow. The result is that millions of people are technically employed, yet functionally trapped every paycheck already spent before it arrives. The Federal Reserve's own data shows nearly 60% of Americans can't cover a $1,000 emergency without borrowing. That's not irresponsibility. That's fragility baked into daily life. Even so-called middle-class households are sliding backward. Families making $75,000 to $100,000 are reporting the same stress once associated with poverty-skipping medical care, delaying car repairs, rationing food, and carrying constant anxiety. And the most dangerous part is how normalized this has become. We're told it's just the new normal. that we should downsize expectations, accept roommates into our 30s and 40s, delay kids indefinitely, and feel lucky to tread water. But that's the social contract quietly collapsing. The promise was simple: work hard, contribute, and you'll build a stable life. What replaced it is survival math juggling bills, choosing which expense to delay, and hoping nothing goes wrong. When entire generations start asking, "What's the point?" That's not entitlement, that's rational despair. Economies don't unravel only through crashes. They unravel when everyday life becomes unsustainably tight. And when people can't breathe financially, they don't plan, they don't invest in the future, and they don't trust institutions anymore. That erosion doesn't show up on Wall Street immediately, but it shows up in anxiety, anger, withdrawal, and eventually social fracture. When basic life feels like a constant emergency, something is very wrong. Housing has turned from shelter into a pressure trap. There's a reason housing dominates every conversation. Now it's because shelter, the most basic human need, has been transformed into a financial choke point. Home prices have risen nearly 50% since 2019, while mortgage rates more than doubled, locking millions out of ownership entirely. But even owning no longer guarantees stability. Property taxes are reassessed higher. Insurance premiums surge due to climate risk, and escrow adjustments quietly jack up monthly payments by hundreds or even thousands. People with fixed-rate mortgages are discovering their payments aren't fixed at all once taxes and insurance reset. Renters aren't spared either. Corporate landlords now control a massive share of rental stock, using algorithmic pricing to push rents to the edge of what people can survive, not afford. Survive. In many cities, a one-bedroom apartment now consumes 40 to 50% of take-home pay, a level historically associated with housing crises. And when housing eats that much income, everything else collapses: downstream savings, health, relationships, mobility. You see the consequences already. Adults moving back in with parents, families doubling up, people living in vehicles, storage units, or workplaces, not because they want to be minimalist, but because they're priced out of dignity. The most alarming part is how quickly this happened. In less than 5 years, housing shifted from aspirational to adversarial. And when shelter becomes unstable, society destabilizes with it. People don't take risks, don't start businesses, don't have children, and don't believe in the future when the ground under them feels temporary. Housing was supposed to anchor life. Instead, it's become a lever extracting everything else: money, energy, and hope. And once people lose faith that they can ever secure a place of their own, something fundamental breaks. You can't build a future on a month-to-month existence forever. And that's why this isn't just a housing issue, it's a warning sign. Healthcare has become a source of fear instead of security. At some point, you realize that healthcare in America no longer feels like something that protects you. It feels like something you have to survive. You don't go to the doctor unless it's absolutely necessary, not because you don't value your health, but because you're afraid of what the bill might look like after insurance. And that fear is rational. The U.S. now spends more than $4.7 trillion a year on healthcare, over $14,000 per person, yet medical debt remains the #1 cause of personal bankruptcy. Even people with insurance are trapped. Deductibles have doubled over the last decade, averaging $1,700 plus per person, meaning many Americans pay thousands out of pocket before coverage even kicks in. Prescription drug prices remain among the highest in the world, and routine care, imaging, blood work, emergency visits can quietly turn into 4-figure surprises. The result is delayed care, untreated conditions, and constant background anxiety. Nearly 1 in 3 Americans now skips medical treatment due to cost, including people with full-time jobs. That's not a fringe statistic, that's mainstream life. And it gets darker when you look at outcomes. Life expectancy in the U.S. has declined, not because of one-off events, but due to chronic stress, overdoses, untreated illness, and preventable disease. Mental health is collapsing alongside physical health. Anxiety and depression rates are at historic highs, yet access to therapy is limited, expensive, and often excluded from insurance networks. So people cope the only way they can, by numbing, isolating, or pushing through until something breaks. Healthcare is supposed to be the safety net that catches you when life goes wrong. Instead, it has become another calculation. Can I afford to be sick? And when a society reaches the point where illness feels like a financial threat rather than a human condition, Something is fundamentally inverted. Health should create stability. Instead, it's now one more pressure pushing people closer to the edge. Trust in institutions has quietly collapsed. You don't need to be cynical or political to feel it. There's a growing sense that the institutions meant to guide, protect, and stabilize society no longer feel credible. Trust in government, media, corporations, universities, and even basic statistics has fallen to historic lows. According to Pew Research, trust in the federal government sits near 20%, down from over 70% in the mid-20th century. Media trust has followed the same trajectory, fractured into echo chambers where people no longer believe they're being told the full story or even the same story. And when trust erodes, confusion fills the gap. People don't know what to believe about inflation, jobs, safety, education, or the future. Every headline feels agenda-driven. Every promise feels temporary. This isn't just an information problem, it's a psychological one. Societies run on shared narratives. That effort matters, that rules are consistent, that outcomes are at least somewhat fair. When those narratives collapse, people disengage. They stop participating, stop planning, stop caring about long-term outcomes because the system no longer feels reciprocal. You see it in voter apathy, in disengaged workers, in people pulling back into private worlds or online subcultures because public life feels hostile or meaningless. Even expertise itself is questioned now, not because people reject knowledge, but because institutions burned credibility through contradictions, reversals, and perceived self-interest. When people feel lied to, even indirectly, they don't just lose trust in one authority, they lose trust in the idea of authority altogether, and that vacuum doesn't stay empty. It gets filled with anger, suspicion, and fragmentation. A society without trust doesn't collapse overnight, but it becomes brittle. Coordination fails, cooperation fades, everyone retreats into survival mode, and once trust is gone, rebuilding it is far harder than destroying it. That's why this moment feels so unstable, not because one thing went wrong, but because the systems that were supposed to hold everything together no longer feel real. Social bonds are fraying under constant economic pressure. One of the most overlooked consequences of what's happening right now is how quietly it's dismantling human connection itself. When life becomes a nonstop exercise in financial survival, relationships stop being places of rest and start becoming sources of stress. People cancel plans not because they don't care, but because they can't afford a dinner, a tank of gas, or the emotional energy after working 2 jobs. Birth rates are collapsing. The U.S. fertility rate is now around 1.6, far below replacement, not because people don't want families, but because they don't feel safe building one. Marriage rates are down, divorce rates remain elevated, and more adults are living alone than at any point in history. Loneliness has become so widespread that the U.S. Surgeon General officially labeled it a public health crisis, linking chronic isolation to increased risk of heart disease, depression, dementia, and early death. And none of this is happening in a vacuum. Economic strain shortens tempers, reduces patience, and turns minor disagreements into breaking points. Couples fight about money because money dictates everything: where you live, how you work, whether you can rest, whether you can dream. Friendships thin out because everyone is exhausted and overextended. Communities weaken because people move constantly, chasing affordability, never staying long enough to build roots. Even digital connection, which was supposed to bridge gaps, often amplifies alienation instead comparison, performative success, and algorithmic outrage replacing genuine intimacy. When people say it feels like everyone is disconnected, they're not imagining it. A society that forces individuals into perpetual stress slowly erodes the social glue that holds it together. And once relationships weaken, resilience collapses. People don't weather hard times alone, they need networks, trust, and shared meaning. Strip those away, and even small shocks feel catastrophic. That's not a moral failing. That's what happens when survival consumes everything else. Life feels smaller, faster, and strangely hollow. There's a subtle psychological shift happening that's hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. Life feels compressed. Time feels faster, days blur together, and milestones that once marked progress, buying a home, starting a family, building a career, feel distant or irrelevant. Psychologists call this future compression, where people stop thinking long-term because the future no longer feels reliable. And you see it everywhere. People delay decisions indefinitely, live more in the present not out of mindfulness but out of uncertainty. Planning 5 or 10 years ahead feels unrealistic when the last 5 years overturned everything repeatedly. This constant instability rewires how the brain operates. Chronic stress keeps people in a low-level fight-or-flight state, impairing memory, creativity, and motivation. That's why so many people describe feeling numb, disengaged, or hollow, not depressed exactly, but detached. The rewards of effort no longer feel proportional, so ambition fades. According to surveys, younger generations increasingly define success not as achievement, but as peace, flexibility, and survival. That's not laziness, that's adaptation to an environment where pushing harder doesn't guarantee progress. Entertainment consumption skyrockets not because people are frivolous, but because escapism becomes a coping mechanism. Doom scrolling, binge watching, and constant stimulation fill the gaps where purpose used to live. And yet, the more people consume, the emptier they often feel. This isn't a crisis of motivation, it's a crisis of meaning. When systems stop rewarding contribution, when effort feels disconnected from outcome, life shrinks to maintenance mode. You do what you must, conserve energy, and avoid risk. But a society in maintenance mode doesn't innovate, doesn't dream, and doesn't renew itself. It just endures until it can't. And that quiet hollowing out of daily life may be one of the most dangerous signs of all, because it happens slowly, invisibly, and everywhere at once. People no longer feel in control of their own lives. One of the most corrosive changes happening right now isn't economic on the surface, it's psychological. More and more people feel like life is something that's happening to them rather than something they're actively shaping. You can follow the rules, get educated, work hard, stay out of trouble, and still feel completely at the mercy of forces you can't influence: markets, algorithms, corporations, institutions, and policies that shift without warning. Psychologists call this loss of agency, and it's one of the strongest predictors of anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal. When effort stops reliably producing results, the brain adapts by disengaging. That's why people feel stuck even when options technically exist. Changing careers feels risky because every path looks unstable. Moving feels dangerous because affordability is a moving target. Starting something new feels irresponsible when the margin for error is zero. Even small decisions carry weight they never used to. And over time, this breeds something darker. Learned helplessness, the belief that nothing you do will materially improve your situation. This isn't weakness. It's a rational response to repeated unpredictability. When rent spikes overnight, healthcare costs surprise you, jobs vanish with a Slack message, and savings evaporate under inflation, the lesson the nervous system learns is simple: don't get your hopes up. That mindset spreads quietly. People stop advocating for themselves. They stop engaging in civic life. They stop believing change is possible. A society where large portions of the population feel powerless becomes fragile, not because people are angry, but because they're resigned. And resignation is far more dangerous than outrage, because it drains the energy needed for renewal. The promise of progress has been reversed. For most of modern American history, there was an underlying assumption that each generation would live better than the last, not perfectly, not without struggle, but better overall. That promise has now been broken, and the data confirms it. Younger generations are earning less in real terms, owning fewer assets, carrying more debt, and delaying or abandoning milestones their parents reached decades earlier. Home ownership rates among adults under 35 have fallen sharply. Student debt exceeds $1.7 trillion, acting as a permanent drag on mobility. Real purchasing power has declined even as nominal incomes rise, creating the illusion of progress while life gets harder. And when people realize that the system no longer offers upward momentum, something fundamental changes in how they relate to it. Optimism collapses. Patience erodes. The future stops feeling like a reward and starts feeling like a threat. That's why conversations increasingly revolve around escape, moving abroad, opting out, minimalism, van life, gig work, anything that reduces exposure to a system perceived as rigged or decaying. This isn't rebellion, it's retreat. When progress reverses, people don't fight the system, they withdraw from it. And history shows that societies don't unravel only through chaos. They unravel when belief in the future disappears. When people stop expecting improvement, investment dries up, financial, emotional, and social. Families shrink. Innovation slows. Institutions hollow out. The loss of forward motion is subtle, but it's one of the clearest signs of decline. A society can survive hardship. What it can't survive is the conviction that tomorrow will be worse no matter what you do. The meaning of life in America has been quietly hollowed out. When you strip everything back, the economics, the housing crisis, the burnout, the fear, the distrust, what you're left with is something far more unsettling than a recession or a bad cycle. The core problem is that life in America no longer feels like it's about anything. For decades, people were willing to tolerate stress, long hours, and sacrifice because there was a shared sense of purpose underneath it all. Build a life, raise a family, contribute, and eventually enjoy stability and dignity. That narrative gave meaning to effort. What's happening now is that the story itself has collapsed. Work no longer reliably leads to security. Education no longer guarantees opportunity. Institutions no longer inspire confidence. Community no longer forms naturally. And without those anchors, daily life starts to feel like maintenance, rather than progress, a series of tasks designed to keep you afloat, not fulfilled. This is why so many people describe feeling empty even when they're technically doing okay. The human brain needs meaning the way the body needs food. When purpose erodes, people don't just become unhappy, they become untethered. Rates of anxiety, depression, substance use, and suicide reflect this loss of direction. So does the rise in nihilism, cynicism, and the sense that nothing really matters anymore. But this isn't because people suddenly became weak or ungrateful. It's because the systems that once translated effort into meaning stopped working, and nothing has replaced them. You can't build identity around consumption, hustle, or survival forever. Eventually, people ask the most dangerous question a society can face. Why am I doing this? And when there's no convincing answer, no vision of a future worth striving toward, the social fabric begins to tear. History shows that moments like this don't always end in collapse, but they do force transformation. Either a new source of meaning emerges rooted in community, purpose, and shared responsibility, or fragmentation accelerates. This is the crossroads. The discomfort you feel isn't confusion, it's clarity. Something is seriously wrong. But recognizing that isn't the end, it's the beginning of deciding what comes next. And that's the part people don't want to sit with. This isn't just a rough patch, and it isn't something that magically fixes itself if we just stay positive or work a little harder. What we're living through right now is a turning point. You can feel it in the way people talk, in the way they plan less, trust less, and brace themselves more. But history shows something important. Moments like this don't only produce collapse, they also force change. The systems that stop serving people eventually get questioned, challenged, and replaced. That doesn't mean what comes next will be easy, but it does mean this story isn't finished. The worst thing we can do is pretend nothing is wrong, because awareness is the first step toward reclaiming control personally and collectively. So if this video put words to something you've been feeling but couldn't explain, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments, because these conversations matter more than ever. And if you want to understand what's coming next and how people are adapting in real time, make sure you're subscribed. Because this moment isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one.